So if you're looking online, you're looking at pictures, prices, etc., and you think, wow, that house looks really great. And it's only, let's say, $250,000 and it's a 1,500 square foot house. And then you look and you see another house that's 800 square feet and it doesn't have as good of a view and it's double the price. And you think, why is that house so much more? And it's half the size, the price is twice as much. What's going on? There are two main things to be aware of, and that is, do you rent the slip or do you own the slip? Of course, other things come into play as they would typically with a house on land, including the view, the condition of the house, the condition of the interior, the exterior, etc., the general appearances, size of the house. All those things also come into play, of course, for a floating home. Whether you rent or own the slip is a huge one. As I mentioned regarding slip rental rates, those can go up over time as compared to an HOA fee, which tends to not go up by a whole ton. But one big one that's not visible at all is also the condition of the float. So a float under a floating house is the foundation under the floating house. It is not uncommon for a floating house to need some maintenance. Maintenance work is required periodically, and what that maintenance is, I covered in a different video. So I have a video on YouTube that I've made about what a float is, what it's made out of, what they typically are made out of, the two main types of floats in and around the Portland area, and what it means for financing. The short summary is, if you're thinking about buying a floating home, the float's going to need to be in good enough shape to qualify for financing. So as of the time of this recording, which is November 2024, there are 3 lenders in town. All 3 of them would require that the float be in good enough shape to qualify for financing. There's a float rating system, which I mentioned in the video about what a float is under a floating house. But the quick summary is, 2 of the 3 lenders cannot make a loan if the float needs any sort of maintenance at all. One of the lenders can make a loan even if float work is required to get it to be in good enough shape to otherwise qualify for a loan. That float work would have to be included in the sales price. We'd have to have a quote from a float builder, and then that float builder would be paid over time as the work gets done. And then the float would have to be re-inspected, and it would have to show that the work that was done was satisfactory for its purpose, which would be, the goal would be at that point in time, to get the float to rate a 4. The float rating scale goes up to a 5. A 5 would be the score of a float under a new house. It'd be a new float, roughly. It'd be a float that's, say, 5 years old, maybe, under a relatively new house. Generally, if a float gets to be older, some maintenance work or even a float replacement is done. Usually what would happen is the float rating at that point in time would be a 4. A 4 is in great shape, actually. From one of the 3 lenders, a 4 that is, would qualify the house for a 30-year loan, which is pretty great. The other 2 lenders lend on a shorter term. One of them lends on a 15-year term, or they'll lend and have you pay as if you're paying on a 30-year mortgage over the course of 7 years. And by the end of that 7 years, you'd have a balloon payment. So you'd have to either pay it off or refinance that loan at that point in time. The other lender that will allow for float work to be done after closing and incorporate the cost of the float work into the loan on a case-by-case basis will lend up to a 20-year term. One of the lenders won't lend if you are a first-time home buyer. Only one will lend it on a 30-year term if the float's in good enough shape, and none of them will lend to an investor. So it's almost like a riddle, but in any case, when we work through what you're looking for as far as a floating home goes, we'll talk through what it is we're looking at, what the price range is, what the condition of floats tend to be in that price range, and which lender it makes sense for you to contact. Because if we're looking in a lower price range, and most of the houses tend to need float work, we wouldn't have you go to the lender who would lend only if no maintenance at all is required. Actually, there are 2 that way now. I wouldn't send you to the lender who doesn't lend to first-time home buyers if you're a first-time home buyer. So, and that all varies, that all changes. Actually, there used to be 2 floating home lenders who would lend to have float work done after closing, that changed earlier this year. So it varies from time to time. Sometimes lenders get out of the business of lending to buy a floating home. Sometimes a new lender gets into it. So rather than name names at this point in time and have this video get super dated super quickly, just contact me anytime when you are thinking about buying a floating home, and I'll help you through that whole process, which is kind of confusing. Now, I mentioned that the float would have to be in good enough shape to qualify for financing. How could you tell whether it's in good? Who has this? Who rates these floats? I mean, who's to say what a 5 is, a 4? By the time a float is a 2, is that horrible? Is it okay? Is it good but not good enough for financing? It's the latter of the 3, but there are only 2 float inspectors in town. There used to be someone else who would come down from Seattle, and I'm pretty sure when I would toss the piece of paper into the recycling bin, it would contaminate all the paper in the entire recycling plant, because it was absolute garbage. It was not to be trusted at all. But the other 2 inspectors who are here in the Portland area are very picky, which is great for buyers. So that also can change. At one period of time this summer, there was only 1 float inspector doing float inspections in and around Portland, which got to be a little difficult to work through the process of buying a floating home using a loan at that point in time. Every now and then I have somebody ask me whether the float or the house somehow or another needs to have zinc on it or some sort of sacrificial metal. The short answer is no. The long answer is no, because the float usually is made out of, well, let's say always, it's made out of a log and stringer configuration, which is Douglas fir logs with pressure treated stringers or structural beams that run perpendicularly across the tops of the logs, or it's a concrete float. Even in the case of a log and stringer float that uses metal I-beams that run perpendicularly across the tops of the Douglas fir logs, there is nothing that would require any sort of zinc, or in fresh water, I think you use aluminum. But no, the short answer to that is there is nothing like that that is required on a float that you need to maintain. From time to time, people ask me whether there is anything they need to do to pump out the tank. What do they do with the gray water? What's the electrical system like, etc. And the short answer to that is the systems in a floating home, as concerns wastewater, water supply, and electricity, are nothing at all like what they are in a boat. They are very much nearly exactly, I say nearly, there's one thing about the plumbing system I'll mention here in a second. They're the same as what they are for a house on land. You'll have an electrical panel, it need to be up to code, it has breakers, it's all the same stuff. Same with the water supply inside the house, same with the waste lines going out of the house, except, and I like to paint this scene instead of some others that we could talk about. But imagine if you're running clean water into the sink and the water runs out the waste line, it goes into a holding tank. The holding tank is not one that you have to bring a cart over and hook up to some pump out system. That holding tank actually is connected to the wastewater line of the moorage itself, and through a series of pumps, it will pump out the wastewater, usually into a public sewer system. If we're talking about houses out on the Multnomah Channel and some floating home morages and elsewhere, those morages might be connected to a septic system or a wastewater treatment system, which they own and operate. So it depends. But back to that holding tank, the holding tank gets full enough, and then there's a float on it that can tell that the holding tank is full. A macerating pump turns on, and then that wastewater goes out through a backflow prevention device into the system of the moorage, and off it goes. It's not your responsibility anymore. So that's how that works. Water supply comes from the public water system or a well, depending on the location of the floating home moorage, into the house. And then, like I said, the electrical system is what you'd see for a house on land. There's an electrical panel, there are lights, switches, outlets, that's all the same stuff you'd see in a house on land. Depending on the time of year. So if we're talking about winter time, this time of year in November, we're getting close to December, etc. One of the things that's a negative about being in a floating house moorage is the walkways can freeze. So as it rains and then it gets cold overnight, the walkways can freeze. Pretty typically at the tops of ramps, there'll be a big drum, you know, like a 55-gallon size drum for holding ice melt and salt and things to be able to spread out. Usually the homeowners will grab some and all pitch in and spread the ice melt out as they can or as they come down the ramps. It depends on the floating house moorage, but that's one of the things to be careful of in the wintertime. It'll get slick. And the walkways are kind of like, it's kind of like when you're driving on the freeway. Sometimes you'll see a sign that says that the bridges freeze before the main roadway. The same is true here because the walkways are up, elevated, and air can flow under them and over them. So sometimes it'll freeze even before the temperature reaches 32 degrees. It'll freeze as soon as, say, 34 or 35 degrees. So that's one of the negatives. Another negative, people often ask me about this in particular. They say, oh, isn't it a real bummer to carry your groceries down from the car in the rain? And what people do is they get a cart, you unload your car, unload the groceries into a cart. I have a folding cart that works really well. You can put it right into the trunk, unfold it, put your groceries in it, pull it down to your house, and it's no big deal. I mean, to compare it to living in a condo in the Pearl where you're trying to get out of your car and there's a car right next to you and your car door can't open all the way and you're trying to get the groceries out and you got to crawl through this little gap between the cars to get back to the trunk and then get your groceries in front of the car and then try to get them into the vestibule that gets into the elevator that closes quickly. That you get the picture. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, especially in exchange for having a great view and being on the river. Carrying the groceries down, even in the middle of winter when it's raining, is really not the biggest deal at all. That's my opinion anyway. What's it like in a floating house in the wintertime? And what I say to that, and I've tried to figure out the way to say it that seems as neutral as possible, but you see those clouds over there, over in the distance, and you can see the floating houses in the background here, and everything looks a little bit wet. The leaves have fallen from the trees for the most part. When it is rainy and when it's gray, when it's cloudy, etc., in a floating house moorage, where the closest house, I guess, is about 40 yards away from me. If we were to turn around, and I'm on Bridgeton Road here in Portland, Oregon, and we look at that house over there, and it's about 40 yards away. And the clouds are up there, it's gray, it's wet, it's rainy, the weather's the same. And it's hard to believe because people think, well, you're on the river, so it must be colder, it must be wetter, it must be more humid, it must be, well, when it's wintertime, the weather's the same everywhere. Now, with that being said, there are some moorages out in East County, so the eastern part of Multnomah County out by Gresham, where they are exposed to the weather patterns that include wind coming down from the east through the Columbia River Gorge. So from time to time, there are some pretty big storms that hit out that way, but otherwise the weather's about the same everywhere. Sometimes people ask about taxes. Floating homes are personal property. They are not real property in that they are not connected to the land directly, permanently. So they're taxed as personal property. It doesn't mean that there is not a property tax. There's a personal property tax. The rates are, let's say, very roughly similar to what they would be for a house on land that's similarly priced. That's the short of it. Multnomah County collects it, Columbia County collects it. It's usually, for example, for a floating home that's priced at, say, around $300,000, the annual tax rate might be $2,000 or $3,000. It could be a little more, it could be a little less. The same is true for higher priced houses. If we're talking about a floating home that's $700,000 or $800,000, depending, you might be paying $3,500 or $4,000 a year. It could be $6,000 or $7,000 a year. It's not dissimilar from what you'd pay for property taxes for houses on land. In every floating home moorage, whether you own the slip or rent the slip, there are rules. The rules vary from moorage to moorage. There are no generalities. It is not necessarily the case that if you own your slip, that you can rent your house out and you can rent it out on whatever term you like. There actually is a floating home moorage where even though slip ownership is included, you cannot rent your house out. In some floating home mortgages, you can rent your house out, but the rental term has to be at least a year. In some, it's 6 months. In some, you can go down as short as 3 months. There are a couple of them where you can rent as short as 1 month. Airbnbs, and what I mean by that is just super short-term rentals, say for the weekend or overnight, are not allowed anywhere currently at all. We get that question a lot, and it's a great idea. I mean, if you were to buy a floating house, imagine all the traffic you could get in the summertime, and people paying up to have a floating home that they can go and party in and park their boat for the weekend, etc. But they're not allowed anywhere. With that being said, I bet you can go on Airbnb in the summertime and see some for rent. And then you're gonna say, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, because I see an Airbnb right here. What I'll say about that is there's a story behind every single one of them. One of those is a past client of mine has a rental. She was renting it out on Airbnb. She also happens to be buddies with the moorage manager. There's a story behind every single one of them, and there aren't many of them. So generally though, Airbnb is not allowed. In some morages, rentals are allowed. In some morages, dogs are allowed as pets. In the morages where dogs are allowed as pets, some of them have a limitation on the weight of the dog that you can have as a pet. There are a couple where you cannot have a dog that weighs more than 30 pounds. In some morages, there is a limit to the number of dogs you can have. In some, they'll allow only 1 dog. In some, they'll allow 2. There are some floating home morages, not many, that'll allow 3 dogs. They're not gonna look necessarily at the collective weight of your dog. So say if you're in a floating house moorage where 1 dog is allowed up to 50 pounds, let's say, they're not gonna say, well, you have 3 dogs, but they're all 8-pound teacup chihuahuas, and so that'll be fine, because you only have 24 pounds worth of dog. They generally won't allow that. In almost all cases, the dogs have to be approved. Sometimes the moorage owner, in the case of rented slips, want to meet the dog before they'll allow the dog to live at the floating home moorage. So that's one of the rules. In some floating home morages, charcoal grills are not allowed for fire safety purposes. In all floating home morages, you just don't smoke on the docks and the walkways at all, on the ramps. It's definitely a fire hazard, and it's not to be overly cautious. If an ember gets down in the dock, in the wood dock, and then there's some, say, cottonwood that accumulates on the dock too in the summertime, it could definitely become a fire hazard. I've seen the results of small fires that have started, but sometimes those small fires grow into big fires. So no smoking on the docks anywhere. That's one of the big rules. Even in places where you're not allowed to rent your house out, of course, there are times where you're going to be out of town traveling. You might want to have someone stay over and house sit for a few days or a week or two. You might have a relative who would come and stay and watch your pets, etc. Generally, that is allowed, but even so, depending on the term of the stay, the person who's going to stay might have to have their background and credit checked and be approved to be there. In one floating home moorage in particular, I know that they don't allow anybody to stay who is on their own, that is, who is not on the lease if they're an adult, 18 years and older. So let's say you're going to go travel for a month and you want to have somebody come over and check on your cat, your dog, whatever it is, feed them, etc. while you're gone. That is not allowed at this one floating home moorage. And in fact, I've heard that even contractors are not allowed to go down to a floating house at that moorage if the homeowner is not home. So the rules, those examples are pretty extreme, but the rules do vary from moorage to moorage quite a bit. One thing that you need to realize is in and around Portland, of the approximately 1,200 floating homes that there are, about half of them are in slips that you rent from the moorage owner. About half of them are in slips that you own. We say that colloquially just to mean that you're a co-owner of the floating home moorage, or the marina where the floating homes are, and you pay a monthly HOA fee that goes towards maintenance of the docks, the ramps. It covers water, sewer, and garbage service in almost all floating homes, whether you pay rent or you pay an HOA fee. If you're paying rent, slip rent, usually it's to an LLC or a corporation owned by someone, usually not a big company. Usually it's a family-owned business. And that allows you to have your floating home there. It also typically, like I said, covers water, sewer, and garbage service. Again, about half of the floating homes in the area are in rented slips. About half are in slips that you would own. Something that we would talk about moorage by moorage if we work together and I help you buy a floating house is what it's like being in any particular given floating home moorage. The rules and regulations vary quite a bit, moorage to moorage. In some, dogs are allowed, for example, and some dogs are not allowed. Now, if you rent the slip, of course, the slip rental rate over time will go up. There are no guarantees in life, but the chances that rent won't go up are pretty slim. HOA fees will go up too, but those are collected by the association of which you are a co-owner, just to cover the expenses. It's not like you would jack up the fee that you collect from yourselves to turn a profit on the company that you own, but it is the case that if you're paying slip rent, that owner does want to make a profit, and slip rental rates will go up over time. So that's something to be aware of. That leads to another question, and that is, by how much can slip rental rates go up? In the past, there wasn't a limit on it, as it was the case for apartments, etc. But in Oregon, there is a law now covering the amount by which rental rates can go up. You can find that information online, and that can vary over time too, but generally there is a rental rate increase cap in Oregon now that has pertained to slip rental rates here in and around Portland. I get asked often whether it's possible for the floating home moorage owner to just kick you out because they decide they don't like you anymore, they don't like your politics, they don't like the hat you wear, the car you drive, the beer you drink, and whatever it is. The short answer is, I'm not a lawyer, I can't advise you. Check out Chapter 90 of Oregon Revised Statutes. That's ORS Chapter 90. There are laws that cover what can and can't be done in a situation in which you rent the slip from a moorage owner where there are 4 or more floating homes. So there definitely are protections. So I've heard, if you're in a floating home moorage with 3 or fewer floating homes, it is possible to get served a no-cause eviction notice. I don't know that that ever happens, and there are very, very few floating home mortgages with 3 or fewer floating homes in them. I know of one for sure that exists. And also ORS Chapter 90 does cover things such as what the reasons are for which you could be served an eviction notice. So that is something to talk with a lawyer about. If you have questions and you're in the process of buying a floating home, you talk with me and I'm helping you through the process, and you want to ask some questions of a lawyer who is knowledgeable about floating homes, definitely ask me. I would say it's money well spent to have peace of mind about what is and isn't doable, what your rights are, what the moorage owner can do, etc. It's definitely worth the money. Sometimes people think, well, I don't want to contact a lawyer. Lawyers are expensive. They're just going to talk a lot and talk very slowly to get billable hours. And that's not the case. They'll help you out, and I think it's money well spent. Another topic that comes up in the process of buying a floating house is, do you have to have flood insurance? And the answer to that is no. There are only a couple of insurance companies that cover floating homes at all. I can put you in touch with a couple of different insurance brokers who will be able to sell you an insurance policy. One of them covers, one of the insurance companies that is, covers what's referred to as perils of the sea. So imagine, what if there's a big boat going by in the summertime and the captain of this cabin cruiser who's plowing along going way too fast has had way too many cocktails and plows into your house. They'll be able to address that. As is the case with every single floating home, you are moving specifically smack dab right into the middle of a flood zone. As you can see behind me, the pilings go up pretty high above the floating homes. There was a flood in and around the Portland area in 1996 that got to be pretty high. And in fact, in some floating home morages, they have markers on the tops of these pilings. Let me try to point like right here that mark where the flood got up to. In some floating home morages, where they needed to, they have added some extensions to these pilings to allow for the houses to float up higher. And the way the houses are connected, I'll just cover that briefly. And I covered it in a separate floating home video about what a float is. But those docks, see the greenhouse right there, the dock is connected to pilings by way of a bracket. And so as the water level goes up, the dock goes up, the ramp moves to allow the dock to go up, so the ramp that goes up to land. And then the houses are attached with chains that go around, usually what's specified as the second log in under those dock boards. So there will be a couple of chains that connect, 3 chains actually, sometimes more, that connect the house to the dock, and everything floats up and down together. So that's the quick summary of that. But if you want to see that video, definitely check out the channel. I have a video all about what a float is and how a floating house is connected to the dock and how it all works. I'm John McPherson. I hope this video helped you. If you are thinking about buying a floating house, definitely call me. I deal in them 7 days a week, about 50.5 weeks a year. I take a vacation every year and turn my phone off. It is glorious. The rest of the time it rings, I answer. You call me, we'll talk. I'm John, give me a call.